Welcome, everyone. Let's start together with a provocation. What might it take for Melbourne to become the world's first city that doesn't just survive the future, but actively shapes it to meaningfully address climate change? What would it mean for a city that recognises its shared obligations to people, place and planet? A city where creative practice, civic experimentation and the protection and repair of living systems come together as part of a shared community commitment to more regenerative futures. Good evening. My name is Wendy Steele. I'm a professor in sustainability and critical urban governance in the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies here at RMIT University. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you to the Capitol tonight for a really special event with Indy Johar, who's a long-term friend and advocate for action on climate change and for planetary futures. I'd like to sincerely acknowledge the people of the Boiwurrung and Bunwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we are gathered. We respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders, past and present, and their custodianship of earth, sea and sky country. And I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be in the audience with us tonight. RMIT is really proud to present tonight's special event with Indy Johar, who's the co-founder of Dark Matter Labs and a professor of practice at RMIT with the Planetary Civics Inquiry. RMIT's Planetary Civics Inquiry is an alliance of researchers, educators, policymakers and designers who are committed to transforming how we conceive, care for and steward our entangled planet in climate change. Indy Johar probably needs no introduction, but he's an architect and a social entrepreneur whose work focuses on redesigning civic infrastructure to support socially innovative and systemic transformation. His keynote tonight addresses and explores how we come together to reimagine our world, and more specifically, what is the role of the planetary and the human, both as sites of resistance and of reimagination. And Indy will then be joined by Berry Liberman, who's the co-founder and creative director of Small Giants and former Editor-in-Chief of Dumbo Feather, and together they'll have a wide-ranging discussion, rethinking our relationship with capital, with community, and what change can mean beyond our sense of crisis and disruption. So hold on to your seats, get ready for a wide-ranging and possibly wild conceptual ride, and please welcome me in joining, to have Indy Johar join us on the stage tonight. So thanks, everyone.
Good evening. It's an honor to be back. I want to talk through something, and it builds on the last time I was here, and I want to open up a story which is one perspective of looking at to the future that we face. I'm going to invite us to look at it straight in the eyes, as opposed to, I suppose, talk about synthetic hope, talk about what is the deep hope that's available when we start to look at some of the realities that we're starting to face and what they really mean, and the invitation that they provide for us in terms of how we look into the future. So, a very simple way to start when we start to look into the future is, over the course of the last 2 to 3 years, people standing up and saying we're facing a 3-degree future has become almost normal. Language like 3 degrees. And the challenge is that that language isn't quite sufficient to understand the implications of what that means. So 3 degrees warming on average will mean 5 degrees warming of land, will mean on average 8 degrees warming of cities around the world, on average. Also, what it doesn't really take account of is that between 1.7 to 1.9 degrees, we will lose one of the major food baskets in the world. So in 2008, when in Moscow, around Moscow, there were fires in the peatlands and fertilizer exports were basically stopped, we ended up with food prices around the world spiking. That spike of food prices ended up driving riots in 60 cities around the world. And some would argue, and that's been well thought through, catalyzed the Arab Spring. So this was just fires outside Moscow that triggered a whiplash effect of prices, inequality, so accelerating inequality and destabilization. So when we often talk about these futures, and this is another one, Madrid looking at 8.5 degrees warmer, and just to give you some context of what that means, 8.5 degrees or 7.5 degrees total warmth means more domestic violence, more people falling asleep while driving, more people actually, sort of transformers breaking down, rails which were designed for certain temperatures no longer functioning, so you get a breakdown of those rails, logistics supplies becoming more vulnerable, maintenance supply becoming more vulnerable. You have this cascade effect. But what I want to talk about is that there's something more significant than the goals that we're talking about, or these destinations that are now charting in front of us, 3-degree futures. And what I want to say is that it's volatility that we should be worried about. And the volatility has already started. You don't have to wait towards the AMOC current most likely collapsing by 2100. What you should be watching is the acceleration of volatility. And in a way, that volatility effect has already kicked off. And it's rooted in stuff like volatility means that temperatures are likely, so this is UK temperatures, which is relatively moderate, will now go from being -20 to +40 range. So the range starts to change. The frequency starts to change. We hit -20s and -40s. And that likelihood starts to increase. And the problem is we're not designed to manage that volatility. And when we start to look at it, that's just the beginning. And they erode our capacity. Look, think back to my question about what happened in Moscow. They erode our capacity to cope. And in particular, as I discussed, they manifest in every location, non-obvious and obvious, bridges, repairs, everything around us. And we don't have the resilience to manage that volatility. But most critically, what happens is there's a sort of almost a chain effect, a crisis chain effect that starts to emerge, where biomaterial volatility drives price whiplash. We experience this in COVID. That whiplash drives inequality. Inequality tears the social contract apart, and that fuels conflict both within and between nations. This particular crisis cycle is actually one of the most dangerous cycles that we can start to see. So often our risk models are rooted only in environmental risk. What they don't do is move through environmental risks to social risks and social breakdown risks, and how they pass through into conflict and weaponization. And this starts to become prevalent in many geographies, in many contexts. So whether it's water systems, hydrological systems, so as the AMOC current weakens, the Mid-Atlantic current, what we start to see is the hydrological patterns become unstable. So whilst you may get, for example, the Alps will still get the same amount of water, the water cycle isn't as continuous, it's not persistent, and the glaciers aren't stabilizing it. So what you mean is you end up with situations where your agriculture, you don't have the water in summer to preserve your agriculture systems. The continuity of the water system isn't there to preserve your mobility and transportation across your water systems. And these risk models are starting to become not only visible, but also starting to be triggered in some locations. So when you start to think about this future, you end up starting to worry about it. And we're starting to already experience this. This is not something new. I think what we're starting to see is the volatility come into effect through direct and indirect mechanisms, whether it's energy prices, nutrition prices, for example. Nutrition, highly nutritious food has gone up 82% in the last 2 years in the UK context. So we're seeing a delamination between nutritious food and calorific food environments. And the risk is, in certain locations, like we did some work around looking at the Himalayas and other locations, what you start to find is that they can trigger into pretty large-scale civilizational conflicts because of the nature of the water cycle in the Himalayas feeds 3.8 billion people and actually becomes a very easy point of systemic conflict between nuclear powers. So what we're seeing is this risk emerging. And at the same moment, what we're seeing is the value of being human is diminishing. So the return on labor versus the return on capital, we're seeing it delaminate. And what that starts to do is effectively undermine human investment. So I was sitting in a slightly unfortunate conversation where it became very apparent that it's becoming more and more difficult to justify investment in health because the health investment isn't giving a return on labor or taxes, because there isn't an economic growth associated with that investment in health. You could argue the same thing is going on in education. So when we start to see this regressive cycle, what do? I've already said that's just one dampening effect. Another one is pretty much what we're seeing, whether it's glacier systems, hydrological systems becoming unstable, we're starting to see them structurally more volatile. Further, it's very clear, as societies, we're still living without the capacity to be able to sense-make together the risks that we're facing. To be able to sense them and sense-make them. Largely because we haven't built the conversational architecture in civilizations, in a complex civilization, to have these sorts of conversations, to be able to deliberate and to be able to move together. It's not about opinion, it's not about somebody telling everyone everything, it's about how we as societies have the conversational architecture to be able to do that. And without that ability to sense and sense-make, we no longer have the ability to manage these risks together. Even though they're we've known about most of these risks now for nearly 30 to 40 years. At the same time, we're seeing constraints start to become more visible. So certainly in the UK context, the UK doesn't actually have the carbon budget to retrofit its homes. The Labour government in the UK has pledged to make 1.5 million homes, 350,000 homes a year. The unfortunate reality is, if you went towards a Paris Accord, it has the capacity to basically build 14,000 homes. That's if it does not do retrofit. Constraints. Labour constraints, because of our politics, are making it very difficult to be able to move forward. And actually, for the first time in terms of soils and agriculture, we're seeing the net loss of agricultural land because of the way we've treated our soils and infrastructure. And the fiscal space in the current model is also shrinking. So there's constraints, carbon, material constraints. Certainly we don't have a super cycle anymore. So whilst there's lots of talk about demand for large-scale transformations and large-scale mineral demands, unfortunately, if you speak to lots of significant mineral actors, they're saying we're seeing the concentration of mineral supply chains and the lengthening of them. But what we don't have is a demographic super cycle of demand to do the investment and the diversification. So because of our demography and global demography, China has pretty much used up its cycle of material demand. So what you end up with is the inability to readjust your supply chains and expand and make them different. The labour and the deglobalization, we're now acting more into a sort of a fragmented and multipolar world, but also a multi-competitive world. So one of the messages I want to put forward to you is that it's unlikely we're going to face a smooth transition. Often I sit in rooms and people sort of say, we'll just smoothly go from where we are, from petrol vehicles to electric vehicles, from homegrown X to sort of X grown nearby in different formats. It looks more and more likely we're facing a volatile transition. A transition where we will actually start to move and the conversations I'm seeing is a move from effectively move towards rebuilding our infrastructures, energy, water, minerals, cognitive security, nutrition cycle, rebuilding our primary infrastructures. I think we're moving from the age of enterprise to the age of infrastructure again. And that opens up a whole series of questions about, in that era, what happens to the consumer goods markets and all the consumer derivatives that are actually very difficult to drive smoothly. So in a volatile transition, again, I've written about this in my Substack, I'd invite you to have a look at it, we start to think about the world in a fundamentally different way. And it also throws up all sorts of things. Increasingly, we're talking about security economics. The continuity of energy, food, water, nutrition will be some of the most critical things around. So instead of focusing on growth, what we're talking about is where are the locations that are able to provide continuity of supply, and that stability function becomes really important. And in many ways, you could argue Melbourne is very blessed. I think 60% of your food comes from local contexts. So you have a high degree of resilience in the nutrition cycle. And so the structural transformation, whether it's materials, biomaterials, all the way through to human cognitive capabilities, I think this is where we're headed over the next period. And if we're going to be able to preserve this. And this shift from growth to continuity and stability becoming the key driver, I think will change where our attention is, where our capacities are flowing, and where value will flow as the world becomes more volatile. Unfortunately, I think we're about to see many territories not being able to preserve stability. In contexts like volatility, most of our states or governing vehicles are designed for stable environments. So as soon as we have high levels of volatility, many states will turn authoritarian, because when you pool risk and accountability to states, their capacity to manage that tends to make them control-orientated. It's not about personalities. It's about the nature of volatility and our current state structures actually not able to deal with the accelerating volatility. So one of the things that we've really got to start looking ahead at is how do you make states systemically anti-fragile? What is the role of civil society in holding state infrastructure and private infrastructure to account? In the UK, we're having one of the most interesting conversations I find we're talking about building a fourth parliament, a citizens' assembly with a citizens' litigation fund attached to it. Why? Because actually you give power into civil society to hold these structures to account in ages of volatility. So how is power constructed? How do we build power that creates pathways for good operation of states becomes really critical. And the economic models start to change, right? So often we talk about investments and we're putting 100 million into X, we're putting 10 million into X, but let me give you a different number. So there are 668,000 homes in London. Sorry, 3.8 million homes in London. Each home is 668,000 is the value of each home, which means the total residential wealth of London is 2.52 trillion. So the risks that we're talking to is no longer about marginal increases in wealth or decreases in wealth. We're talking about total asset value loss. 2.52 trillion. How do you invest and think about this in radically different ways? How do you build resilience to preserve those assets in radically different ways? And in many ways, we're going to have to find new ways of investing in it. And this is why I think resilience, stability financing, continuity financing becomes really important. I think we're going to see a lot of massive conversations around how do we, security economics and stability economics of being able to stabilize key environments and new ways of financing them. And those climatic stabilizers are everywhere around us. So one of the things we've been doing a lot of work around is working with cities to say, how do you cool 4.5 degrees? How do you stabilize a glacier environment? How do you renew a river system? How do you actually manage a hydrological cycle upstream and downstream in the face of AMOC disruption? How do you renew a bioregion as pieces of infrastructure? And when you start to look at these sorts of activities, all the way to working with one city in Northern Europe, to say, how do you improve human development, not as a unit by single thing, but as a whole city investment in human-machine development? So you start to think about these problem spaces in a fundamentally different way at the infrastructure level. All the way through to kind of all of these examples are starting to be manifest and starting to be discussed and organized. This requires a completely different way of thinking. You know, we were talking earlier today all the way through to how do we think about, you know, the dreaded word geoengineering. The reality is, if you look at the Antarctica, it's virtually impossible right now with the amount of carbon we've pushed in the air to be able to stabilize the Antarctic without positive regeneration of that environment. I'm going to put it in that language so it's easier and more palatable. So we're now operating no longer in a world which you can conserve and step back. Conservation was a window that was available to us maybe to 2004, 2010. We no longer have a conservation window. We have to move into a regeneration window to be able to regenerate those environments and stabilize those environments. That means not only do we need new types of institutions, but new types of capital structures to be able to operationalize into them. And all of this requires new ways, and many of these goods are transnational goods. So I hope many of you have read the US National Security Strategy, which is rooted in the theory of statehood as the predominant vehicle of organizing the planetary commons. I think we're going to see vast amounts of work on transnational goods. Certainly, if you're looking to manage your hydrological cycle in the UK, you're not going to do it alone. So the growth of transnational institutions are going to become very critical in a new form of diplomacy, but also pathways for new forms of planetary governance. So the River Danube was the site of war before actually the site of before it became the site of international waters. The UN system effectively was born in the River Danube because we had to come to a new conclusion of how to govern critical commons. So I would put forward to Antarctica, I would pretty much put a bet on, unless we're able to stabilize and regenerate the Antarctica, we're not able to effectively find a way to deal with planetary governance. If we lose the Antarctic, we lose sea level rises by somewhere in the region of 65 meters. Pretty much most coastal cities don't exist. 65 meters. So in that sort of context, what becomes aware, I think the Antarctic is almost certainly the site of future planetary governance. You want to innovate how we will live in the planet, we have to solve the question of the Antarctic. And the danger is that actually without any of these responses, we are laying ourselves, like I said at the outset, to war and accelerating conflict. And I want to make this clear. War does not sit on the carbon budget, right? there is no carbon accounting for the war machine. i.e., we are then in a runaway crisis. And this is where it starts to get more hopeful. And the hope starts here. There's no pathway for people to isolate themselves from this risk. So number one thing I've often heard when I've stood into a room and somebody will say, look, Indy, we'll get down to 1 billion people. And I was like, interesting. And why do you think it'll stop at 1 billion? And the problem is, I don't think there's a way that we can stop that crisis. Once we go down the cycle of war, we will self-terminate. Lots of good reasons I can tell you. We did some work on the new war calculus. It's very difficult to stop. And when you look at that scenario, that basically leaves us with one choice: mutually assured thriving. Because every other pathway leads us to mutually assured destruction. And in that sense, that's where I start to get hopeful. Because I think when you're faced with that choice of it being only about mutually assured thriving, we start to open up into a new way of thinking about the future. And what we value, and what we price, and how we organize it. And it requires us to also reimagine what it means to be human. I think one of the most systemic questions, if we're not able to ask, is how do we value being human? And a unit of labor as it's currently conceived is insufficient to value the potential of what it means to be human. And I think this is going to be one of the epistemic questions. Because if we can't, I guarantee you the war machine will effectively drive large-scale human conflict. So, the war on the planet, I'm coming close to a close as well. I want to give you a hopeful moment. Many of you know the blue marble picture, yeah? Beautiful picture. I want to reframe that picture for you, because everyone talks about the picture as the overview effect, where you look back on Earth and you marvel how incredibly delicate the planet is, seeing in a sea of black space. I wanted you to think about this picture in a different way. That picture was the Earth perceiving itself. And that picture was the Earth perceiving itself. The Earth became self-aware. That, I give you, is an extraordinary thing. I think we're living in an age where we're being forcibly re-entangled. The delusion of separation, the delusion of divisibility no longer works as climate breakdown and other effects forcibly re-entangle us at the planetary scale. They are eroding a delusion of the last 400 years where we saw the world in objecthood and subjecthood and separation. And the science of this has already been in place for maybe 70 odd years. But culturally, it's an invitation to operate in a new theory of entanglement. Culturally, it's a place to operate in a new theory of an explosion of agency, of life. Seeing everything as life as opposed to seeing everything as dominion and dead things. Because we're going to have to operate embracing complexity, operate embracing entanglement, not operate in the illusion of boundaries. And what we're being invited to in this crisis is a metamorphosis of not only our environment and how we perceive it, but a fundamental deep code transformation of how we imagine ourselves and our relationship to the planet in radical formats. So, as James Lovelock sort of talked about the planet becoming self-aware, I think this is a chrysalis moment of a transformation of who we are and how we manifest in the planet. And by looking straight into the eyes of the crisis that we're talking about, the crisis is not a crisis, it's an invitation to be metamorphosized. And I think that is genuinely extraordinary. And I think it changes everything, like all the way from property, our theory of property, our theory of stewardship, moving towards theories of stewardship, our theory of how we organize, our theories of how we imagine ourselves. All of this stuff starts to be reimagined. And so, what I want to close this conversation, and we can open up into discussion with, is that when I look into this problem, I now see an opportunity and a way of perceiving a transformation that is much deeper than just merely EVs. And I think that is the invitation. And that is why here at RMIT and Planetary Civics Inquiry, there's an inquiry to explore what it means to manifest in this form of knowledge. And it changes literally everything. Even how we imagine what it means to be human. You'll see in one of my Substacks I talk about, if you put significant neuroscientists in the room, they would say, well, there's a good likelihood that consciousness is, that not only is the planet becoming consciousness, that consciousness perhaps is a download. Right? It's the essential component in the whole universe. And that would challenge all the Copernican revolution we were in the middle of. Because it would recenter consciousness as the center of the universe. So I think we're living in a moment of rather extraordinary transformations of everything we've talked about and believed. And there's no one else coming to do this for us. So the question is, how do we open up this conversation? My final point and hope, what I found extraordinary in the last year is this conversation, which typically I would have had only in private, in small groups. I've been having them with capital holders. And 2 major capital holders said to me, Indy, we anticipate in the next 30 years we will lose 90% of our wealth. 90% in the next 30 years. That was their conversation about their own perception of wealth. And suddenly they were saying, we need to think differently about our theory of entanglement. Our wealth is fundamentally entangled with the planet, non-divisibly slow. You've probably heard me say on one of my speeches, there is no viable New Zealand strategy. You're Aussies, so you'll appreciate it more. So in that context, if we're all entangled, I think it's inviting a completely different type of conversation. So everything I've said, start to see as a strategic opportunity and a need from our generation. There will be no space to hand over to another generation. You are the generation. We do it or we don't. And that, I think, is both an opportunity, but an invitation to look smack back into the darkness and look for the hope, the real hope that's available and visible in front of us. But it requires us to look at the numbers and through the numbers to the scale of the transformation. And I think it's radical beyond belief. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am sure there are lots of questions, and I'd like to save enough time for those questions, so be ready. Someone will come with a microphone. Indy and I we're actually dear friends, and we've done lots of thinking together and talking. And that was an amazing presentation, so thank you, as always, for your incredible depth of thinking. And it's really exciting that you're here and this conversation is being had in my hometown, in Melbourne, because in our work at Small Giants with Regen Melbourne and B Corporation and so many of the cultural movements and social infrastructure that we've been a part of, it's been in order to foster a rich sense-making so that we could then act appropriately and in a timely fashion from the data, from the science, from the realities that we're facing. And so my job tonight, which is hilarious, is to try to scaffold from your conversation into praxis, into what does everyone in this room do with both the harrowing aspects of your presentation and the hard-hitting truths. When we sit with them, instead of going into overwhelm, what are the strategies for answering the question of what it is to be human in 2025, what it is to be a good ancestor and a custodian and a parent. We both have young teenage boys who are going out into the world, and so that question of what it is to be human and how I thought we might help talk about it is through the 3 horizons.
Sure.
So do many people here know about the 3 horizons framework? It's just one of many great frameworks. We talk about it at Small Giants Academy as Horizon 1 being triage. Horizon 2 is transition, and Horizon 3 is transformation. And it can be really, really helpful to know which horizon you're working in, thinking in, doing in, acting from. And you and I have had this conversation where you burst my bubble that the idea of islands of coherence, what I heard you say then is that's really Horizon 2. So can you speak to how we might use a framework like the 3 horizons to come down from that altitude and calibrate to our daily lives? How do we know the right questions to ask and the best things to do, and place ourselves in the horizons? I loved that Horizon 3 is mutually assured thriving.
Yeah.
That's a vision. So now, what's the scaffolding for us to get there?
Yeah, it's really it's more challenging than. So I was in Birmingham at Civic Square. We're working together on a retrofit street. And in that retrofit street, we're not material first, we're not energy first, we're neighborhood first. So how do you literally retrofit? And in that conversation, what became very apparent was the traditional business models of retrofit are based on health outcomes, jobs created, so on and so on. They are social outcomes. And this goes back to my point, that when you start to see the value of humans collapsing, it's becoming more and more difficult for governments to justify those investments because there isn't the health return on health. And so what became very clear was that retrofit was effectively a site of human resistance. It was a resistance to what the current economic model was reducing humans to be. And our ability to actually use it as a site of resistance to rediscover what it means to be human, I think becomes a really important conversation. So I think some of the things I'm finding are, where are the sites of resistance? Where are the sites that and we had neighbors, everyday neighbors come in. Kate Rayworth, who's extraordinary, came in the back room talking about these questions. In middle of Birmingham, Ladywood, back room of a house on a street with neighbors in the room, right? And I thought that was really extraordinary. So I think what we've got to find is, where are these politically charged sites of resistance where you can start to have these conversations? Because I do think this is a fundamental thing. I think then, for me, on top of that, comes the really hard philosophical questions about what does it really mean? And where I've been getting to, and again, I'm not going to say this is truth, but I would invite many of you brilliant people to be challenging and making this better. I can certainly say, all these conversations that we have about, humans have creativity because AI doesn't. I'm really sorry, that's not going to be enough. If you've used any of current AI tools, you'll be knowing that this idea of humans as a preserve of traditional creativity isn't going to be sufficient. But I think what's more philosophically important, and I think this is where philosophy matters, is if you read Descartes properly, you see a key linkage where he goes, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. It doesn't say those 3 words, but if you read the paragraph before, it's all about the construction of doubt, not certainty. I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. It is virtually impossible for either one of us or any of you, however brilliant you may be, to know everything. It's informationally impossible for you to know everything, or to us. Now that's profoundly beautiful, because what that basically means is we only have partial knowing. We exist in systemic doubt. Right? And in having partial knowing, I am now curious about Berry, because I can never know everything. So I have to live with curiosity, I have to live with doubt. And when you live with doubt, you have to live with an idea that there is a shadow to your knowing, and thereby you have to talk about tentativeness, tenderness, and care. Care is not a service, care is a way of being in a world that you can never have total knowledge about. I think why I'm stating that is that what I find beautiful about that is embodied beings, which is what we are, actually our doubtfulness may be our most beautiful thing, because it allows us to become systemically social. It allows us to operate systemically with care. And this is in contrast to the last 400 years of machine learning and machine models, which are rooted in certainty, which are rooted in execution, control, and instruction. So I think one of the next horizons for me is our embrace of doubt. And then the third horizon for me is, I think, what I was alluding to, that I think if you were to put in some very eminent neuroscientists, they'll be talking about consciousness in a very different way to what all of us perceive consciousness to be. They're talking about it as being a download function, quantum tunneling in our brain, and a whole different way of perceiving ourselves. So I think there's something extraordinary about being conscious. I think there's something extraordinary about the nature we operate with partial knowing, and I think it's something extraordinary about seeing the site of human resistance in a house, in a back garden, in the middle of Ladywood. And I think that's a scale of kind of horizons that we need to work through. And I'm not giving answers yet. I don't have them. But I also think if you reimagine what it means to be human, you also reimagine machines. Tentative machines, doubtful machines, caring machines. And I think that's a much more interesting horizon to operate in a complex world. And this is a complex world that appreciates its entanglement as opposed to lives with the illusion of all-knowingness and its separatedness. And so morality there is not a function of separation and I being moral. It's a function of appreciating your partialness of knowing, and thereby morality is a way of being rather than a judgment on or discernment on the world. I think it's a fundamentally different worldview when you follow that all the way through.
Indy, it's so beautiful always to hear you talk, because the thing that you might be mistaken with you is thinking that you're all head, but actually you're heart and spirit. And that's where you're coming from when you weave these complex breakdowns and sense-making maps for the rest of us. It's incredibly helpful, and I think I was doing a summary of your talk. And if the planet has become self-aware, and we are consciousness expressing itself, therefore what we imagine and action through re-entanglement opens up a future of mutually assured thriving. And there's too much for us to talk about in the sort of 5 minutes that we have. But really what you're talking about is a spiritual evolution of us, a consciousness elevation, a cognitive ceiling that lifts, all of it in sort of urgent service of that thriving future. That's really hard. And so I just kept thinking while you were talking, we know the data, we know the science. We even know in many ways if we get into a room together and like we do at Regen Melbourne and other forums, sort of sense make what would make this city resilient. I love the provocation around moving from enterprise to infrastructure. the agreements we would have to come to shift our collective lens. We've just done it in Australia around social media for children, but that's just like nothing in the scheme of what you're proposing. What came up for me was how much inner work will have to be normalised in order for us to remain curious during collapse.
It's true, and I think the adjacent way of looking at it, not the other way, the adjacent way of looking at it is, I really go back to this thesis about embracing our doubt. What I find deeply worrying is that we are living in a society that valorizes opinion. And actually what's much more interesting is not the valorization of opinion, but the embrace of doubt, and thereby the curiosity of a conversation. And societies which are able to structure conversations as opposed to publish opinions will do much better. And the really interesting part is we now have technologies that are able to construct large-scale conversations. And we have to move from communication theory to conversational theory. Conversational theory allows me not to be valorized for opinion, but actually the dialogue. And the dialogue is everything. Because in dialogue, the bandwidth of communication is much larger, but it also requires me to operate and valorize doubt, not certainty. So I think there is inner work, and the inner work is in the shifting from the illusion of certainty to actually the actual informational manifestation of existing and enjoying existing in doubt and the shadows of our knowing, to live in the curiosity of the other. And that is the inner work. And it's no longer like, and I would argue that that's available, it's informationally certain. If any of you are smart enough, and most of you, if not all of you, are, the science, there is mathematical science to saying you will not know everything. Right? And if you just accept that one point, everything else is just a little simple derivative.
In your estimation, but what you're proposing is that we shift from a human consciousness that is heavily weighted on the transactional to the relational.
Yeah.
And to do that, we will have to be humble and curious.
And I think it's the only way to operate. The embrace I have in this is no longer a debate of morality. I'm no longer saying, please be humble, because it's a moral invitation. I'm saying it's informationally impossible for you to know everything, and thereby I ask you to operate in doubt as the only way of operating in that theory set. And so there's a relief in there.
Yes, but you have to arrive there from a generous shift of posture.
Yeah.
Because it feels funner to have certainty.
I think shadows are beautiful things.
Yes. Yeah, beautiful. I'm going to turn to questions because I feel like I have so many that will be here for a really long time. Can we have the lights? Great.
Well,
hands
Yes,
are up
I've got
in
one
the
here.
middle at the back.
Can you hear me?
Oh, we've got?
Yeah, it's me. Yeah.
Great.
Hi, I'm Sahar. I'm from the Municipal Association of Victoria and Australian National University. Just one quick question is that we all know that it's known to believe that if you want to drive change, you're going to start with the lowest hanging fruit. My question for Indy is that what are your lowest hanging fruits?
I think the lowest hanging... So what we're seeing is conversations about cooling a city by 7.5 degrees are no longer off the table. What we're seeing is glacier governance is no longer off the table. Hydrological systems of two nation states, how do you deal with them as a result of an AMOC collapse is no longer off the table. Things that I thought were just speculative case studies are now being actively engaged by governments and other parties. The world is different. So what used to be, EVs and synthetic, in sort of some some solar panels, I think the conversation has completely changed in the course of the last year. I think what are the fundamentals? I would say I really believe this question of the future of being human. If we cannot solve this, we are not going to make it. And I find it so remarkable that every conversation I go to in the futures conversation is all around the future of AI, and there's virtually nothing of equivalent weight around the future of being human. And I think that is the more interesting question, frankly. So if I was allocating resources, that's where I'd put them right now. Because if we don't figure that out, I don't think there's a way in. I think the next one is food systems. I think one of our food systems are going to be a site of real destabilization much earlier than we anticipate, probably in the next 5 years or so. I would put a major food crisis on the table. So actually restabilizing our food systems, I think all of that stuff is going to happen through a security lens. I think we're going to see significant market reform as privileging continuity of supply rather than actually the efficiency of capital. So we're going to see good, solid reconfiguration. And these are conversations that are already on the table. So what I've found is in the course of the last year, things that I thought were la-la land conversations that you could never have are now on the table. So I think even the Antarctic conversation, we've been talking to Andrew Kelly, ex-CEO, so Australian CEO of the Antarctic Science Foundation, and the type of conversations we've been having around what it means to deal with the Antarctic are just completely different. So I think we are seeing that change move much quicker than we anticipate. I think the biggest problem we have is actually the capabilities, the capital flows to start to think about this in the right way. But those conversations are on the table.
And you were talking recently about those capital flows shifting because people are understanding medium-term risks to those capital flows. Totally. And so starting to invest in social infrastructure and questions of not only what it is to be human as a resilience strategy.
I mean, so the city we were talking about to deal with cooling, we've had 2 West Coast investors from the US get in touch with us and say, how do we invest in actually a whole outcome accelerator to cool the city? And we see this as a future of demand. So people we would never have thought would have reached out to us to start to capitalize. We had the same thing with food systems work. So we're seeing capital markets start to recognize the risk, the planetary insolvency is real, and it's starting to move. So I don't think the problem now is, I think there is recognition on the capital side. We often, in many of these rooms, think of capital as not our friend, but capital is not our friend only if it's not smart. Capital which is smart recognizes it's fully entangled and it needs to operate, and it is starting to operate.
Turns out the planet is a closed loop system.
Precisely.
I've got the microphone up the back. Hi, I'm Karen from Our Kinds, and I'm so excited to hear your discussion tonight, Indy. So coming at it from the perspective of individuals and consumers, and as a startup that's looked at how do we shift an everyday habit of getting a reusable coffee cup to how do we not focus on the product but focus on human behaviour. And in doing that over the last 4 years, actually develop a philosophy, an infrastructure like a living entity that is an operating system that is delivered by humans and by the choice they make every day in their everyday coffee habit to fundamentally shift a waste crisis, because the coffee cup is purely a communication vehicle that translates across the hospitality sector, across any other sector. It's like, how do we just follow the journey of this thing and make different decisions along the way? What I'm interested in is how do we get that conversation in your rooms? Because I know that's been the challenge for Maslow as well, potentially, I don't know. But definitely for Corylus. There's a few of us sitting up here that are working on kind of really everyday ideas and very individual kind of decision making that actually can create positive collective action that can shift behaviours, shift sectors, shift markets?
So, I mean, firstly, thank you for everything you're doing. I think we're starting to see those conversations. So, for example, if you build a timber house, the timber in your house needs to basically be sequestered for about 500 years. So if you build a timber house and you basically, after 50 years, push it out, we have a problem. Because we need to store the carbon for 500 years. So the conversations we're in the middle of is, if you build a timber house, how do you own the liability to store that timber, the carbon? So suddenly you are owning a liability, a stewardship responsibility, to steward that carbon for 500 years. So we are starting to see whole new conversations about material chains, material governance, material sufficiency, post-ownership to material stewardship conversations. The question is, which markets are going to move first to be able to embrace this sort of landscapes? So I think this, today I was at the School of Fashion, and it was really clear that we're starting to have quite different conversations about, a shirt. My shirt is a £45 shirt, but if you were to really pay for it properly, it's between £250 to £450, 5x to 10x variable, which means that I can't own shirts the way I own shirts, right? So that means that my material economy becomes fundamentally different. So I would argue we're going to have to move towards a sufficiency economy. We're going to have to move towards a sort of stewardship economy of our materials. We're going to have to move towards an abundant economy of intangibles. We're going to have to move to a regenerative economy of our biomaterials. And we're going to have to move to growing a reproductive economy of care. And these economic arrangements will be different with different theories of discount rates, value, and other formats. And I think those things are already on the table in different ways. So I think you're absolutely right. The question for me is, which products are going to create these markets and precedences in which sequence? And I think that's what we're going to find out very quickly soon.
It's making me think as well about the role of aesthetics in that future visioning, because it's utilitarian and absolute in its sort of infrastructure mind. And we get there with some hope, and also with, if any artists are in the room, how do we vision that with beauty and aesthetics and the other sort of aspects of how we create a moral universe comes from being reminded what's worth saving.
Exactly, and this is why I have to say, in conceptual terms, I'm totally with degrowth, but in political terms, I'm not. So I think we need degrowth of our material economy. We need an explosion of our intangible economy. We need to regrow our economies of care, and we need to regrow our economies of biomaterial economies and circular biomaterial economies. So when you look at it, this is a rebalancing and a restructuring of these economic models into different frameworks. And I think we've over-financialized it, over-constructed our economy on a theory of allocation of scarce goods. And I think we're going to have to re-engineer that. So,
is that what you were saying when you were saying before that it will unlock the imaginal?
Totally. And the infinite imaginal.
I love that.
Totally.
Okay, let's do that.
Hi. I come from a background, started the Enhanced Games and now volunteer for the Teal Independents. You're speaking of complexity, of complex coordination problems, of anti-fragility. In Australia, in a liberal democracy, our current supposed political mode of thinking is liberalism. What role do you see liberalism or its fundamentals, like individualism, play in this brave new world?
It's a great question. I think this, the way I'm looking at this is, I think we have to go through individualism. So what I'm interested in is expanding freedom, but a freedom to actually operationalize in doubt. This is why I was talking about the doubt, the partiality of knowing. So the human development aspect of this becomes really critical for me. What I think we should be talking about is the explosion of agency, but an agency which is able to appropriately operate in doubt, in partiality of knowing, in systemic care. And this is, I think, a developmental question for us. So I don't think this is about collective constraints. I no longer believe it's possible in a complex system to do top-down governance.
Okay.
Right? It's just very, very difficult. So I think one of the languages that I think people currently, many people, feel entrapped by our systems. So the question is, how do we make this political move of both expanding freedom, but also expanding the capacity to operate in conversation, not in doubt, in care, as a way of being? And I think this is a really sophisticated move, and I don't know how to do it, but I'm sure some of you will be able to figure it out. But I think we have to expand people's horizons of being whilst we invite their care. I think it's going to be a combinational move, not a single point move. It can't be one or the other.
It just making me think as well, before we get to that next question around conversations, there are systems theories and systems frameworks. We've been talking about it a lot in our own work, that if trauma overlays those systems, those frameworks, we can't actually get to
Exactly.
the actionable, the effective action. And so we also need healing, for lack of any better term, healing, the repair, the restoration, the regeneration needs to happen to us at the same time, in tandem.
No, totally. And I think one of the things there are traumas that have happened to us in our past, but there's also traumas of future lives lost. An idea of a life that we thought was ours is not ours. And we're going to be living not just in the traumas of histories that have happened to us, but futures that were no longer available to us. And how we reconcile these traumas and allow us to be able to work at the intersection of them, I think is going to be really important. And this is, for me, why the truth and reconciliation work is going to have to be multidimensional to allow us to come together, to deal with this journey.
So we're not designing from trauma, but we're designing
Precisely.
from healed places between us, inside us.
Yeah.
Hi, Indy. Thank you for your wisdom today. I work in food systems, and I'm working on linking equitable access to food with values-based supply. We are working in an environment where our government is shutting down Big Health, which is a leading prevention body. Can you please speak to, pardon me, can you please speak more to how we go about structuring the economics and financing around demand-side innovation? That was a very interesting thought piece you put out, especially for communities who do not have the money in their wallets to offer profit outcomes.
Look, I'm sure you will know more. I think one of the most substantially worrying things is that we do not value soil. Like, underneath all the conversations is also soil. And our farmland is not valued on its soil, the density, on the improvement and quality of soil. I think one of the big challenges that we face, as you rightly point out, is that, and this is what I'm worried about right now, is that we are in a world that we are going to get a food crisis much more quickly than people are talking about. Our market economics aren't designed for continuity. They're designed for the efficiency of capital, which means our food markets will break. Right? There is no surprise that your supermarkets in Australia are considered national infrastructure because they are critical. I think there are real fundamental questions we're doing work around universal basic nutrition in Sweden. We're looking at what that would mean, how would you provide it, what would that look like, because I think these are new forms of universal basic goods. We're going to have to talk about universal basic goods in fundamentally different ways. I think we will enter a different type of world. I mean, we're just about to share a piece of work around what the future of welfare potentially looks like into those sorts of conversations as we move into volatility. I think the connection in food, for me, is going to be about how you preserve continuity and don't break the social contract. I think that opens up a completely different question about nutrition and food supply and provision, and it's not food banks and stuff like that. So I think there's a really important question about how we value and finance that stuff. in radical different ways. I think it's almost certainly going to be the biggest land shift, how we govern and operationalize land. Rewilded food is the highest density nutrition food that you can get. I think you're talking about agroforestry, precision farming techniques, multi-species farming. All sorts of things are going to have to happen, and they are not going to be, they're going to be machine-human ecological systems interacting in radically different ways, and we're going to have to build this land transition. I think it's almost as big as what we saw in the Industrial Revolution in terms of shifting our land use in really radical ways. And I think these are all linked economies. We're going to all pretty much have to be vegan. I don't know how many people here are vegan. Yeah, thank you. But we're going to.
How do you know there's a vegan in there?
Exactly. So we're going to shift up to plant-based diets, most people, realistically, and that's going to also release the biomaterial economy that we need for the rest of our societies. So this is a complex land, nutrition, biomaterial transition. I don't think we're yet doing the work as an integrated level to do those transitions. And I think these are going to be bioregionally driven, they're going to be driven by continuity needs and other frameworks, and then new ways of financing that work in really different ways. We're going to have to look at soil value in fundamentally different ways, value soil as a continuity provider, all sorts of things. And I think security economics is going to be a key part of it. This will not be funded in a traditional format of market-based models, because I don't think the headroom exists now on the consumer side. So traditionally, food was 20% of people's income, right? That's what it traditionally used to be. It's been 7%. I think housing has become 50%. I think there's a whole bunch of recalibration that happens between now and then to be able to reprice food and revalue food, not reprice it, revalue food into society. But it is a real structured transition problem.
I think we have time for no time. Oh, we have time, generally, but no time for more questions. So, in the spirit of that, and I think an ongoing, incredibly privileged conversation that Melbourne gets to have with you, Indy, thank you for coming so far to be with us, to share with us your remarkable ideas, the depth of your thinking. It enriches the cultural field, and I know it helps everyone in this room think deeper and be really nourished by future thriving. I think we could all agree on that third horizon. Indy Johar, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to you and everyone here.